Hello, this is Dr. Levi Armstrong. I am a graduate professor here at Amberton University in the Human Behavior and Counseling Department. In private practice, I'm also a clinical neuropsychologist, and I'm looking forward to providing you guys these mini lectures. This is the first lecture of hopefully many to follow. I am pretty certain I figured out how to make this work, but hopefully we'll be able to download this to Moodle and get this going for you guys. So just sit back. This is going to be about a 10-minute lecture. There's a lot of information that I'm going to cover real briefly, and we won't cover every slide, but I just want you to be able to at least kind of hear some of the bigger concepts that I think are important. If you start to feel overwhelmed with this class, I would encourage you that this is the first really exposure to a lot of words, a lot of concepts, and scientific principles that will be rehearsed substantially over the coursework here in your graduate program and beyond. So don't worry too much if you feel like you're in over your head, because if you're feeling like that, then that means you're in the right place, because this is a good time to learn. But don't worry about all the words that you don't know yet, or the parts of the brain that you don't know yet. We will rehearse and review that over and over again throughout this semester. So today is just going to be kind of the brand new exposure to that. So first and foremost, I want to kind of talk a little bit about the DSM-5 and what we're going to be covering here. What you need to know, bottom line, is that the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, is the 5th edition. It's the most current edition, and that's it contains all of the diagnoses that are used in clinical mental health agencies and environments. And even if you don't necessarily believe in diagnosing or labeling, or are really worried about that, you still need to know this information, because this is how the medical community communicates with each other, and for the most part, the vast majority of all counselors. So just knowing the information and knowing what the diagnoses are, how they're diagnosed, and what the basic criteria are is going to be really important for your career, no matter where you end up. What I want to talk about is the DSM-5 compared to the DSM-4. Long story short, is the DSM-5 in a lot of ways has become a lot easier to use than the DSM-4, because the DSM-4, the previous edition, the 4th edition, and the TR, just so you know, stands for text revision. But the DSM-4 had 5 axes of diagnoses that a clinician would have to make for each patient. And so what that means is that every patient that came in, or every client that came in, would get a diagnosis, and that diagnosis would consist of all 5 of these axes, where the axis 1 would be where you would put something like depression. Axis 2 is where you'd put, like, if there were the presence of a personality disorder or intellectual disorder. Axis 3, if there were any medical conditions. Axis 4, what kind of barriers to care or current psychosocial challenges that would affect treatment. And then Axis 5 was considered the global assessment of functioning, which was just a subjective scale from 1 to 100, where you would rank your client in their level of functioning, with 100 being perfect functioning all around, and 1 being lack of any functioning. The DSM-5 no longer uses that system, thankfully, because it was just really cumbersome, and no one really understood it outside of psychiatry. So here are all the different diagnostic categories that we will cover in this course. Next week we will talk about neurodevelopmental disorders and kind of go through that, as well as probably start integrating some of the neurocognitive disorders at some point sooner rather than later, because This is, in fact, the adult and geriatric psychopathology course. So some of the basic steps for diagnosing, and understanding that diagnosing is another word for differential diagnosis. So when you see the words differential diagnosis, or somebody asks you, what is your differential diagnosis? Understand that that is implying a process. Diagnosing is a process, differential diagnosis is a process, and it's the process by which you arrive at a fairly conclusive diagnosis. So in other words, you rule out all the other disorders that the symptoms could be manifesting. So what I want you to remember from this slide is that diagnosing is really imperative as a skill for a professional counselor. And understand too that when you make a diagnosis, for the most part, DSM-5 diagnoses are considered working or clinical diagnoses. And so it doesn't mean that once you diagnose somebody with depression that they will have depression for the rest of their life. It just means that at that point in time, that's what you felt was the most accurate label for their symptoms. Now there are caveats to that, which we'll cover later, but I want you to understand that there is a gravity or a weight to diagnosing that we all need to be mindful of and be careful of, and especially cautious when making a diagnosis. But also understand that a diagnosis doesn't necessarily mean that that person will have it for the rest of their life. Just some history of abnormal behavior, which I'm sure you probably remember and have covered in other courses. So we won't go into too much detail with that, but you need to know that culture over time has influenced our perception of what we consider normal versus abnormal behavior. Where we are currently is really more in the biological model or the medical model, whereby psychiatry and neurology, and I'll throw in neuropsychology there, has really put out theories on why we do what we do, and where our motivations come from. Prior to that, and I would say concurrent with that, the psychological theories emerged, which is where we get our counseling theories from. And I would even say prior to that, there was mostly an emphasis on spirit or spiritual beliefs and religion in relation to how people behaved. Now, currently, I would say is that, and it's actually I think a positive thing, is that there's a movement to reintegrate spirituality into our concept of human behavior, and truly I think that's the most holistic way of doing it. Let's see. So we're going to do a crash course of neurobiology, and I've got just about 5 more minutes here before I start running out of time to keep this file size as small as I can so that you can actually download it and watch it. But first I want to just kind of highlight the basics of what our brain does biologically, because you've got to understand the biology behind this before you can start to even conceptualize the psychology. Because in my opinion, the biology is the foundation of psychology, meaning that if you don't have a brain, you don't have a psychology. So with that being said, let's just talk about some basics of what the central nervous system is, and start with the brain. So the brain is a dynamic organ that begins its development in utero and continues developing and is not fully mature until about mid-20s, early to mid-20s. The brain develops back to front, and it's the frontal lobes that develop last. And when I say develop, what I mean specifically is that the connections inside the brain are fully formed or myelinated. You've probably heard of that term before, myelin. So myelinated axons, which are the connections between the neurons, the brain cells, is the white matter, and the gray matter are the actual neurons themselves. And so when we say gray matter, we're talking about neurons. When we talk about white matter, we're talking about the extensions from the neurons, or the cords that connect each neuron to the other, and those are covered in fatty white myelin, and that is what makes up the white matter in the axons. So the central nervous system is composed of the brain and the spinal cord. Then you have the peripheral nervous system, which is the autonomic nervous system, and the enteric nervous system, which is kind of incorporated sometimes theoretically with the autonomic nervous system. You've probably heard of the autonomic nervous system, and that's where you get the sympathetic system and the parasympathetic system. So the autonomic nervous system, the best way to remember that is that you've got a fight or flight response that is constantly wanting you to be alert and awake and engaged in your environment. And then you've got the rest and digest, or the parasympathetic side, that is trying to get you to go to sleep and to recover. Those two systems are always on, and one, the sympathetic system is winning or is in charge most of the day, and then the parasympathetic system is in charge most of the night. A lot of our theories behind psychopathology come from dysfunctional sympathetic versus parasympathetic systems, and with predominantly sympathetic systems, or the fight or flight response, being too revved up. All right, so the brain has 4 lobes, and in each of it there's 2 hemispheres of the brain. So you have a left frontal lobe and a right frontal lobe, a left parietal lobe, right parietal lobe, and so forth. And each part of the brain, at least to make it simple, each part of the brain geographically has very specific functions that it does. Now, like a computer or a car, if you took one of those parts of the brain out, or one of the car parts out by itself, it wouldn't do anything. It needs the whole system to work. And that's how our brain is as well. But you've got to remember, though, that if there is damage to any part of the brain, or there's a developmental difference in any part of the brain, that function is going to be weaker. And that's also where we get a lot of psychopathology from. All right, so to start us off here, let's see. I want to talk about the limbic region of the brain, and this is really the main area that we are concerned about as counselors. And what you'll see is that the limbic lobe, or the limbic region, it's not really a lobe, it's on the inside of the brain, and this is where we get most of our emotional processing that occurs. And what you need to remember is that there's 2 main parts of the limbic region that you need to remember. There's two nuclei that are extremely important, and that is the amygdala and the hippocampus. So the amygdala, or AMYGDALA, and the hippocampus, those are the 2 main or most important parts of the limbic system. And the reason why is because the amygdala is what drives our fight or flight response. It is what processes our environment, incoming stimuli like what we see, what we hear, what we feel, and even what we think, and determines whether or not it is a threat to our survival. It does that because it is what allows the hippocampus to determine what's important to remember. So if you can remember this, just remember that our brain, its primary job, or what it's concerned with, is keeping us alive. Now, there's all different types of philosophies with that, but you need to remember that the brain biologically cares about your survival the most. And so the amygdala is always on, and it is always trying to determine if there's something in the environment, whether external or internal environment, that is potentially harmful or threatens your survival. And that it is doing that so that the hippocampus, which is where our long-term memory storage or consolidation occurs, is always recording. And it doesn't want to record everything that isn't necessarily related to our survival, because we don't have enough storage space for all that. But it does want to record things that are related to our survival, so that you will remember to avoid dangerous circumstances in the future. That system is turned on, and this is important. That system is turned on during while in utero, and so the record button is pressed, so to speak, while you are still developing in your mother's womb, and it remains on throughout one's life. And in fact, the whole brain is built around what the amygdala and the hippocampus determine what is important to remember. So I think for today, we're going to stop right there, and I'm going to pick back up next time and continue on with these lectures, just to kind of keep this time down a little bit. But this is the style and format that we will use for these lectures, and hopefully I'll be able to get these all uploaded here pretty soon. It's a work in progress, so just be patient with me, but I'm looking forward to presenting all these slides with you, and hopefully it'll be a little bit better than just staring at a slide by yourself and being able to hear me actually teach on it. Thank you for listening, and we will, I guess, talk to you next time. All right, take care.